Tonight, crisis in Ukraine.
This is not just about Ukraine. It's about China. It's about President Xi and Taiwan. It's about the Ayatollah and the bomb. It's about North Korea that just fired off 2 missiles.
The global repercussions as Russia amasses forces at the border. And the latest on COVID-19 and soaring rates of inflation. Hear from the former president's chief of staff.
You know, that Joe Biden knock-on-wood strategy is just not producing results.
Plus a spat of deadly police shootings across the country. All this and more tonight on Faith Nation. The drumbeat of war as tensions escalate with Russia. Good evening in Washington, D.C. I'm Jenna Browder. Will Russia invade Ukraine? That is the question facing the world tonight. The Pentagon says the U.S. has made no final decision to deploy U.S. forces, adding that 8,500 U.S. troops are on heightened alert.
The United States is deeply concerned about the current situation in Europe. We remain keenly focused on Russia's unusual military activities near the Ukrainian border.
Meanwhile, the U.S. is helping shore up Ukraine's defenses in case diplomatic talks fail. CBN's Brody Carter has our top story and the latest on this mounting crisis.
With growing fears that a Russian invasion is imminent, the U.S. State Department is telling the families of U.S. diplomats in Ukraine to leave the country. This as the Biden administration weighs sending U.S. forces to our NATO allies in the region.
If a single additional Russian force goes into Ukraine in an aggressive way, as I said, that would trigger a swift, a severe, and a united response from us.
More than 100,000 Russian troops are believed to be along the Ukraine-Russia border, including to its neighbor to the north, Belarus. The British government now claiming it has intelligence that Russia is plotting to install a pro-Russian leader in Ukraine. The UK says several former Ukrainian politicians have been recruited for the measure. Russia calls it nonsense and disinformation.
It is certainly possible that the diplomacy that Russia is engaged in is simply going through the motions, and it won't affect their ultimate decision about whether to invade or in some other way intervene or not in Ukraine.
As diplomatic talks continue, another shipment of U.S. military aid arrived in Ukraine, including 90 tons of ammunition and anti-tank missiles. NATO countries are also sending military aid. Sunday, lawmakers pushing for stronger sanctions and military aid to deter Putin.
We need to be very aggressive in pushing back against President Putin, whether that's in the form of sanctions, as well as continuing to equip our Ukrainian friends with not only defensive capabilities, but also offensive weapons.
Representative Mike McCall, the top Republican on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, warns that the world is watching the U.S. reaction.
This is not just about Ukraine. It's about China. It's about President Xi and Taiwan. It's about the Ayatollah and the bomb. It's about North Korea that just fired off 2 missiles.
Over the weekend, White House officials said President Biden might send several thousand U.S. troops in addition to warships and aircraft to NATO allies in Eastern Europe. The latest Trafalgar poll shows nearly 85% of Americans believe America should have a limited involvement if Russia invades Ukraine. Brody Carter, CBN News.
All right, thank you, Brody. And here with us now, John Hardy, research manager and Russia analyst at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. John, welcome. So the Pentagon says Putin is showing no signs of de-escalation on the border of Ukraine. Spokesman John Kirby adding that 8,500 U.S. troops are on heightened alert. What does that tell you?
Well, it's a good first step. First of all, it's good to be with you. Thanks for having me on. It's a good first step. It's a step towards reassuring U.S. allies in Europe that, the U.S. will have their back if the situation with Russia deteriorates. I don't expect those forces, if they are deployed, will be, in any way involved in the invasion in Ukraine if that comes to happen. But it's just really just a step to reassure U.S. allies.
Yeah, the U.S. and NATO are sending military aid to Ukraine. In your opinion, is it enough or is it too little, too late? What's your thought on that?
Well, I'm glad they're doing it. Every bit helps. But, no, it will not make a fundamental difference, at least into the initial Russian invasion. You have to remember that Russia possesses superiority in the air. Ukrainian air defense is just woefully inadequate to deal with what Russia can bring to bear in the air and from ground-based missiles. So, if Russia's invasion gets stretched out into a prolonged occupation, then that's a situation where things like Javelin anti-tank missiles, Stinger anti-aircraft missiles can have more of an effect. But in terms of the initial operation, those things won't do much at all.
What should the U.S. be doing?
Well, we've got to send as much of that stuff as we can. Actionable battlefield intelligence is probably the thing that would most help that we can actually do at this point. Better, more advanced, mid-range air defenses would be great, but that's going to take months to a year or two get deployed and Ukrainian forces trained up on. So it's not really an option within the relevant escalation time frame that we're seeing, which is somewhere in like the late January to February time frame.
Is a large-scale Russian offensive likely here, or will Putin be able to achieve his goals with a limited standoff?
Well, I think it's kind of a million-dollar question. I would say that any operation almost certainly will include that air and missile component during the initial period of war. I think it's highly unlikely that Russia could compel the Ukrainians to do what Putin wants them to do, namely accept Russian domination only through the air. I think there'd have to be a ground component. Even then, I'm not sure that Moscow may be overestimating how easy it would be to for example, install a puppet regime in Kyiv. That the Russians may sort of have a rose-colored glasses on how much resistance they'd face. But anyways, to answer your question, there'd almost certainly be a ground component.
Yeah. All right, John Hardy with FDD, thank you so much. It's great to get your insights tonight.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, to COVID-19 and new signs, the Omicron variant is slowing down. Right now, case numbers are declining in more than half the country, but still critical in other states. In those areas, cases remain high in hospitals. ICU capacity nationwide also at its highest level in a year. The U.S. is nearing a pandemic record of 147,000 patients receiving care, with 1,800 people losing their lives to COVID every day. The federal government urging all Americans to get up to date on their vaccinations, saying boosters slash the risk of hospitalizations by 94% for the Delta variant and 82% for Omicron. Well, backlash on Wall Street over soaring rates of inflation as the Russia-Ukraine turmoil grows. Before making a major comeback, the Dow falling today over 1,000 points at its weakest point, making for a 7th straight down day. And S&P now heading for the index's worst month since March of 2020, shedding up to 2.9%. The Nasdaq down by as much as 3.4% today before coming back up. And for more on the roller coaster ride on Wall Street, let's bring in Joel Griffith, research fellow in the Rowe Institute at the Heritage Foundation. Joel, thank you for joining us tonight. What accounts for these major tumbles and this roller coaster ride in the stock market today?
Well, thanks for having me. Yes, we saw quite a bit of volatility today, and that really continues what we've seen throughout now the course of the beginning of 2022. There's a lot of uncertainty in our economy, and unfortunately, our own government policies have created that uncertainty. If you look at the rising prices, we have prices rising at the fastest clip in more than 40 years, combined with so many millions of people that have actually chosen to leave the workforce entirely. And then you compound that with what you see in parts of the country, such as Michigan, where once again, schools are shut down in some of the state. And parents have the uncertainty of not knowing whether or not their children are going to be in school or at home. This is really driving the uncertainty. And sadly, it is government that is causing these problems.
Today, the New York Times published an editorial board opinion. President Biden's economy is failing the Big Mac test. Essentially, they're saying the average worker's paycheck now buy fewer hamburgers. Joel, in your opinion, is the White House taking inflation seriously enough?
This White House has been asleep at the wheel when it comes to inflation. And you bring up an excellent point, even with food costs. You see a lot of families, because food costs are rising so rapidly, and other costs, just the basic cost of filling up your vehicle, which in many parts of the country has doubled in the past year and a half, and then rental prices that are up in many parts of the country 15 and 20%, and families that are trying to buy new homes are realizing they're priced out of the marketplace. A lot of families, when they're going to the grocery store, if they can find the items they're looking for, they're finding, wow, we can't even afford to have a nice steak once a week. They're going ahead and buying ground chicken in substitute. And this is happening, though, in so many areas of consumers' lives. People being forced to either delay purchases or to go ahead and do a substitute that just a few months ago they would have found completely unnecessary.
So at the same time, that New York Times editorial credits the president's economic aid package for shielding Americans from the economic effects of the pandemic. You know, as bad as inflation is, Joel, could things be worse?
Well, in actuality, all of this government spending that we've seen over the past year and a half has actually made the situation worse. You know, so many families, they love getting those checks, for instance, in their checking accounts or in their mailboxes from the government about a year ago. Well, that's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to new spending. And now these same families are finding that let's say it's a couple making $80,000 per year. They're finding that $80,000 buys a lot less. In fact, the rise in the cost of living for most families has far outpaced the rise in the wages and has even dwarfed the amount of government aid these families have received the past year and a half. All of this spending has consequences. We borrowed from future generations, and we had to print the money to pay for it.
All right, Joel Griffith, we're out of time but Joel Griffith with the Heritage Foundation, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
And coming up, you know them well, David Brody and Nathan Gonzalez are here for our Faith Nation political panel. Welcome back. Tonight, the former president's former chief of staff is speaking out with an interview with CBN's David Brody. Mark Meadows responding to President Biden's first news conference of the year, calling the White House response to inflation a knock-on-wood strategy.
That Joe Biden knock-on-wood strategy is just not producing results. So what will they do for the next year is they will spin it, as we started to see yesterday, that it's not Joe Biden's fault, that it's the Republicans' fault, and you need to change your expectations because it's not really as bad as you really think it is.
And for more on this, let's bring in our Faith Nation political panel. We have CBN's David Brody and Nathan Gonzalez, editor and publisher of Inside Elections. Both welcome. Great to have you with us tonight. David, let's start with you in that interview. You know, Mark Meadows told you it was a knock-on-wood strategy. The New York Times says President Biden's economy is failing the Big Mac test. What are the political ramifications for this White House if it can't get inflation turned around?
Well, it's everything, Jenna. And, you know, the Big Mac test, the knock-on-wood strategy, you know, here's the litmus test for the Biden administration, the grocery store shelves. That's it. You know, every time you walk into a grocery store, and you know how much I love to talk about cream cheese, Jenna. If you can't find the cream cheese, if you can't find something that you're out of, you may not be thinking right then in that moment, boy, I tell you what, that Joe Biden, I really got a problem with him. I'm not saying people are saying that. Actually, some people are. But most people are at least subliminally thinking, wait a minute, what in the world is going on here? And it all goes back to inflation and the supply chain. And, you know, Joe Biden talking about the Fed and this is going to happen and there's a recalibration of this. And, you know, who cares? All people want to know is, can I get the cream cheese? And I'm telling you, this is a problem.
Yeah. You know, a recent poll, Nathan, from NBC News points to a major downturn for Democrats in the upcoming midterm elections. Could the president's plummeting approval numbers get better between now and Election Day?
History tells us no. Actually, after that NBC poll came out, I went to the Gallup polling archive. They've been polling presidential job approval ratings for the last 70 years, going back to Harry Truman, and there isn't a single president in a midterm election whose job approval rating increased significantly from where we are today in the cycle till Election Day. And actually, the average drop in presidential job approval over those 18 elections is 8 points. And so President Biden is at a 40% job approval in the latest Gallup poll. I'm not predicting that he's going to go down to 32%, but for those Democrats who believe that time is on their side, that if it just a little more time, these crises will work themselves out, or the economy is going to get better, and thus Biden's job approval rating is going to bump up. It's possible, but history doesn't show that. It shows a much more stable environment, that if voters have made up their mind about a president, that it's difficult to turn that around.
Yeah. I want to talk about the previous administration. The Supreme Court decision around the White House records last week led to the release of some 700 pages in relation to the January 6th riots, including a draft executive order that would have seized voting machines. David, it was never signed by President Trump, but what does it mean for the investigation into the January 6th riots and possibly Trump's involvement?
Well, it'll give the committee more fodder. And once again, this is not a bipartisan committee. Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, we have to remind everybody they are Republicans in name only. When I say that, I really mean that. I mean, they're with the Democrats on this. So it's 9-0 on that committee. And so, look, it was a draft executive order. It was never signed, as you say. But all of a sudden the committee will make this, part of the evidence. And look, the truth of the matter is there was a lot of stuff going on there, right? Sidney Powell was in the Oval Office. You had John Eastman. You had a lot of different people saying a lot of different things to the president. But ultimately, it never got signed. But once again, the Democrats will make hay on it for sure.
The former president's former Attorney General, Bill Barr, he's cooperating with the January 6th committee. Barr reportedly telling investigators he had no information on the events of January 6th. Nathan, could his testimony be helpful in this investigation?
Well, it depends on what he says and what he has. I mean, that's the bottom line. In my opinion, that the more that comes out, the less it looks worse for President Trump and even some Republicans on Capitol Hill. And so if there are any more the more information that comes out, you just see that Republicans, there's a little more to it. And I understand that the draft order wasn't signed, but just that there was an environment at the White House that some people thought it was okay to even bring something like this up, that basically were proposing that potentially the Secretary of Defense and the military would go into every precinct in the country and start seizing voting machines. That was the draft. That was the idea. That would even be a possibility, I think, is something we should take seriously.
Yeah, it is remarkable. Switching gears here, on Sunday, yesterday, we saw thousands of protesters in Washington speaking out against masks and the vaccine mandates. How much is the White House response to the pandemic going to play in the midterms? David, we'll start with you.
Listen, I got to tell you, I'll be honest, and I don't think I'm in the minority on this analysis, but I do believe I might be in the minority in terms of speaking this out loud. But here's the truth. Until the Biden administration figures out how to deal with the unvaccinated and the anti-mandate crowd, the ones that you saw in D.C. on Sunday, then it's over for them. I mean, in other words, there are a lot of independents out there. This is not just, right-wing crazy people. All right. These are, I mean, look, they had a Louis Farrakhan, Nation of Islam guy speaking at the rally. They had African Americans who were frustrated. I mean, I go down the list. This was a bipartisan kind of a big tent situation. Until Biden addresses that, until the administration tackles the mandate issue, which they will not do. They will not do this. They're going to double down into their grave, their political grave. I really mean this, Jenna. They've got to address it. It is the smart political thing to do. Look, I'm not into giving the Biden administration advice or the Trump administration or the former Trump administration advice. But how do you politically, you got to address this. This is a big deal in this country.
All right.
And they're not doing it.
Yeah.
It boggles my mind. I can't even understand.
All right. Gentlemen, I'm so sorry. We have to leave it there. But thank you both so much. And we'll be right back.
See you.
A series of police officers shot is getting renewed attention, the latest in the nation's capital, following officers killed over the weekend in Texas and New York. CBN's Tara Mergener has more.
At least 18 police officers have been killed so far in the line of duty this year. In New York City, the mayor and other local leaders are planning to crack down on illegal guns. The latest attack, an overnight ambush in Washington, D.C. At least one officer rushed to the hospital after a man opened fire.
Before they could contact them, he started firing shots at these officers.
This attack follows the fatal shootings of Corporal Charles Galloway in Houston and rookie officer Jason Rivera in New York City. Rivera and officer 27-year-old Wilbert Mora are the fourth and fifth from the NYPD shot this month.
He lied to take care of everybody in the street. And the child he see, he give a hand, young people, baby, everybody. You're 22 years old.
His mother overcome with grief as Rivera's body is escorted by fellow officers to the funeral home. Mora, Rivera's partner, remains critically wounded. Investigators say the suspect's gun is a stolen Glock with a high-capacity magazine, able to hold up to 40 rounds.
We don't coordinate to go after those gun dealers that are supplying the large cities in America, such as New York. We are losing the battle, and the federal government must step in and play a role.
Last year, the U.S. saw the highest number of law enforcement officers killed in the line of duty since 9/11. Later this week, leaders from several states are expected to launch a task force on gun violence.
We have to do more to fight the scourge of illegal guns on our streets, and we need Washington teaming up with us, teaming up with locals to get it done.
The NYPD says it is bringing back a plainclothes anti-gun unit to target known offenders. Other states are also asking the feds to step in to help. In Washington, I'm Tara Mergener, CBN News.
Still ahead, a medical miracle. 2 lives knit together, and the lengths their parents went to bring them home. Finally tonight, medical miracle. A Chicago couple went in for a routine ultrasound at 20 weeks and received some startling news. Not only did they find out they were having twins, but imagine their shock when they found out their babies were conjoined at the chest and belly. The couple packed up and moved so the twins could be treated at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. Addie and Lily were delivered by C-section and separated nearly 11 months later.
The girls have guided us through this last year of life. They've showed us what having hope and faith really is.
Oh. And the family of 4 is now home in Chicago, the girls growing stronger and stronger, each on their own. And we will leave it there tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you right back here again tomorrow.